Hi, I'm Michael, and this series presents a deep dive into a secret that I've been keeping for most of my life, but one that should never have been kept at all. It's my hope that learning my secret and the insights it has given me will help you understand either your own secrets or those of at least one person near to you. These audio episodes were originally recorded and released as a single 7.5 hour long video on YouTube. That video was really just me talking to the camera, so other than a few title cards, one thumbnail, and some body language for context, you're not really missing anything by listening rather than watching. Either way, you'll hear my message. That said, I only got asked to make an audio version after the original video was completed and released, so please understand that this introduction, my spoken trigger warnings, and the episode structure and breaks have all been hacked and hammered in after the fact, and please also excuse the few references to this video and the thumbnail. I don't think there will be anything too confusing in audio form, but if there is, a link to the original video is in the show notes. Also in the show notes will be links to any references and resources I mentioned in this episode. There are 8 episodes in total. Please only listen to them in order, as that order has been very carefully and very painfully chosen. This is episode 5 out of 8, Descent. It discusses extreme depression, suicidal and homicidal ideation leading to psychological crisis. Hi, I'm Michael. And I was 15 and seriously self-harming. The first time I hit the point in my experience of depression that I started to think that I had to either change or die by my following birthday. I'd had suicidal ideation over the years since I was 5 that had appeared as really quick, disturbing, intrusive, and unbidden impulses and thoughts. But during this period, these progressed quite rapidly to dreaming nightly of leaping to my death, waking to a sense of intense disappointment at still being alive. And as my birthday, which for some reason I had started to think of as my deadline, grew closer, active and methodical planning. That kind of thinking, of even reaching the threshold level of depression where suicidal ideation starts, is understandably harder for a lot of people to relate to, if only because those thoughts and that action have, for less understandable reasons, been stigmatized by pretty much every culture there's ever been. All of us carry some remnant of our culture's confirmation bias and stigma with us, and that remnant underlies a lot of our fast-twitch opinions and feelings on the topic, which tend to fill in when we haven't put real effort into deeply considering it. Well, if you've reached this far with me, I think you're a thinking being who is capable of that consideration, and I would hope and expect that a thinking being could, if only as a mental exercise, consider, if not empathize, with how very disturbing and difficult it would be to find your mind, which just minutes ago had not been projecting that choice in front of you, suddenly presenting it to you as an option, and possibly a very tempting option. That thinking being could also, I hope, set aside for a moment any moral judgments. Again, this is only an exercise, and consider, if not empathize, with how that same depressed brain might so distort the world that to the person within it, that option isn't just tempting, it's justified, and possibly even the only justified or justifiable option. If you're still with me here, then we may have temporarily bypassed at least some of the thought-terminating cliches that form a culture's specific, probably not very well thought through, stigma around suicide. Permanently abandoning that sort of stigma requires a very significant investment of time pondering an already very uncomfortable topic. So for the purposes of this video, I'll provide a shortcut. I'm an extremely thinking being. My hypervigilance developing to the level it did means I don't do anything but think, violently think, and I'm accused of overthinking all the time by people who think of themselves as overthinkers. I've also invested a significant portion of my life thinking on this specific topic, so I'll give you 2 axioms and the conclusion they lead to, and together they can, hopefully, save you making that same investment. The axioms are straightforward. First, if it has the right to live, then it has the right to die. Because it's going to. Second, if it lives, and it has the right to think, then it has the right to think about dying, because, again, it is going to. Unless you either have no body at all, or you have a body that cannot die, there is no workable escape from those two axioms. From there, the conclusion is kind of obvious. If it has the right to live, and it has the right to think, then it has the right to consider the manner and the circumstances of its death, and the right to actually determine that manner and those circumstances. And that right is, and always should be, and always should have been, absolute, inalienable, and not even up for dispute. If you have a body, and it is going to die, then there exists a set of circumstances in which the choice to end your own life is the morally correct choice to make. Don't think so? Consider Hitler, or if it's easier, Mr. Spock. There also exists plenty of circumstances in which allowing you to end your own life is the morally correct choice for society to make. Don't think so? Consider anyone ravaged by an absolutely untreatable cancer that's past the point where any amount of morphine or other painkillers works. The cultural stigma where I live currently would force me to endure any amount of agony to fail to defeat an untreatable tumor. While that same culture can and will euthanize my dog or my cat without my or the animal's consent as soon as that same tumor is discovered. Cultural stigma doesn't make room for actually thinking beings, and that's because those stigmas weren't developed by actually thinking beings. The purpose of cultural stigma might originally have been to try and discourage people from making that choice, to disincentivize otherwise healthy people from using a very permanent solution to treat a possibly temporary problem. But it has proven terrible at those goals, and it has only ever done more harm than good. One single person who can set aside their stigma long enough to listen with empathy can do what no amount of cultural stigma can ever accomplish, while no amount of people with any amount of empathy can undo what a single piece of terrible cultural judgment can cause someone to do in the moment. The goals underlying the stigma might be worthy. In fact, there's a lot of rights we might have that we probably should only use very rarely, after much consideration, and only once we've taken the people around us into careful, well-reasoned account. In an ideal world, maybe there are rights we would have, but would never need or want to use. But cultural values and ideas we lean on before we've begun to understand the context aren't a good or even useful way to hear someone out and understand why they've been thinking what they've been thinking. These values and ideas are just another kind of thought-terminating cliche. They allow us to avoid having to think too deeply about a subject that makes us personally uncomfortable, and they allow us to avoid having to empathize with someone else and actually meaningfully grasp the reality of their situation. Maybe we shouldn't assume that they are otherwise healthy and considering a permanent solution to a temporary problem. Maybe we should consider that they might be significantly unhealthier than we know, or that they're thinking about a permanent solution to what to them is an actually permanent problem. And importantly, their thinking might be right, and their death may actually be necessary, and it's even possible we should be willing to help them on their way. And we need to make room for that, while cultural stigmas can't. Cultural stigma says this act is always wrong. But if there exists a single valid exception to that rule, then we need to make room for the fact that there may be other valid exceptions. We need to be able to consider a world in which the rule isn't a rule so much as a possibly very weak suggestion. So now that we can see the value in setting aside our cultural stigma, I'm going to ask you, other thinking being, to consider and at least try and empathize with a depressed child that has just found themselves having suicidal thoughts. When those thoughts feel justified, and they're still stuck within their own cultural context and its stigmas, and they have all the moral judgments of their own thoughts that come with those. Now imagine being an increasingly depressed child who has had glimpses of suicidal thoughts in the past, and then, from their perspective, found themselves driven by painful experience and painful choices towards thoughts and action that every adult they could consider reaching out to for help has already either refused to discuss at all or has already told them are wrong. Not just wrong, but sinful. Not just sinful, but unforgivable. When the supposedly responsible adults have either engaged in outright denial or modeled nothing but shame and judgment, to the point of invoking the eternal hatred of a supposedly loving God, what are the odds that child will seek out their help or the help of that God, no matter how desperately they might need it? If the child beats those odds, what are the odds that help will be the reply? How likely is it that such a depressed child in that context is going to receive meaningful, non-judgmental, and actionable support? The first time I found myself actively suicidal, I did actually try to reach out for help. The depression was clearly overwhelming me, and while I didn't have the slightest clue how to even begin talking about all the specific experiences that were driving my depression forward, I did know enough from the messaging and media I'd received that I was supposed to share with adults the fact that I was starting to seriously consider ending my life. My ability to do that was substantially impaired by the CPTSD that was ultimately the cause of the depression. Ironically, if I hadn't been traumatized at all, then I would have had significantly more options for help with the direct outcomes of that trauma. So I probably could then have accessed what I probably then wouldn't have needed. With my history, I couldn't possibly consider talking to men. The bus driver and my father had left me with simply no hope of ever feeling sufficiently safe to talk to males about anything broaching on the emotional or the sexual. One of the most painful tragedies of childhood sexual abuse is how a single event by a single actor can utterly, and for much, if not all, of a lifetime eliminate the ability to trust half the human population in an instant. Unfortunately, that also eliminated the chance either of my uncles could have helped, though I'm pretty certain they would have listened if I'd been able to approach them at the time. It also meant that many of my teachers, and essentially all of the school administration, were just automatically filtered out. That last part eliminated my female teachers from consideration as well. I really admired my principal, for instance, but because of our shared chromosome, I couldn't trust him with any of my secrets, and that meant I couldn't trust anyone I already knew would be required to report what I said to them up to him. I'm taking pains to explain my thinking here to show how CPTSD can narrow the scope of people who might help down to just a very few, very quickly. This is how my specific thinking went, but everyone with similar experiences will face the same general problem. In my case, that left the women in my life who weren't my teachers or other school staff. I can't imagine I or any 15-year-old boy trying to talk about genital self-mutilation with either his mother, his aunts, or his grandmother, so female relatives were eliminated as well. That left my doctor, who I was never in contact with long enough to find the words, my rapist's mother, and the mothers of a very small, and due to the depression, very dwindling circle of friends. With one exception, who to this day I regret not reaching out to, but didn't because I just didn't want her to think of me as broken. That left a bunch of mothers who'd been marinated in some seriously screwed up and ignorant ideas about suicide. The specifics of those ideas, again, don't matter. To explain them would be to fall into at least critiquing, which some people would inevitably see as attacking, a particular set of religious dogmas. Those of you who don't like religion at all might cheer that perceived attack, but those who do might shut off this video, and then I'm ironically left preaching to the choir. I really don't want to do that. If you're a believer and you've made it this far, I want you to keep going. It's really important to me that you hear me out all the way. But the other problem I face is that if I explain the specifics, then a lot of people who are religious would start commenting that those folks just had their religion wrong. And they'd be right. Anyone who has actually read the books involved and actually understood the words would know these ideas were, as I said, seriously screwed up and ignorant. But that would still leave us distracted from the important point. If my CPTSD hadn't filtered so many people out, maybe I'd have heard from someone who had their religion right, who'd heard the ideas found in that faith in a way that gave me something valuable here, in this very painful moment I'm in. That's why it's important for me to make this clear. I don't have a faith. My specific experiences mean I can't possibly have a faith. But I'm not attacking faith in general. I'm not attacking a faith in particular. I'm not even attacking their specific personal faith. I'm just trying to make it clear how some not particularly well-reasoned ideas drawn somehow from that faith by these particular adults in this particular town at that particular time served to put a child more at risk of suicide than he had been before they'd opened their mouths. And in that particular town, I wasn't alone. I was just one of the lucky ones that didn't share that faith, and I could think through and deflect at least some of the worst of these particularly bad ideas. I have lost an absolutely shocking number of friends from that town to suicide, addiction, and self-harm, and almost every one of them was someone for whom faith was important, right up until the adults they trusted, because they shared their religion, failed them, betrayed them. What matters isn't what they said. What matters is that every kid with these kinds of thoughts needs help and counseling from mature, informed, and fundamentally adult points of view. What matters is that they'll only seek that help at all after they're at risk, and only where and when they think there's someone fundamentally safe who they can trust enough to seek it from. And what really matters is that any adult that responds to any child broaching topics around suicide, sexuality, and self-harm with any kind of religious fundamentalism can't be trusted and doesn't qualify as an adult at all. And that includes the children for whom religion and even fundamentalism matters as much as it includes the ones like me for whom it didn't. The very last thing that a suicidal kid who hates themselves and believes, rightly or wrongly, that they're already stuck in hell needs to hear is that absolute worst case scenario all suicide is going to do is leave them stuck there. I was actively suicidal. That's already isolating. And on top of that, I was an atheist in a deeply religious town. I already had a limited support base to draw from. And when and where I did reach out for help, including from my rapist mother, I received nothing of value. In fact, I got negative value, and a lot of it. Because those I reached out to simply couldn't set aside their cultural stigmas long enough to just listen, much less think. The adults who just leaned on denial, the sort of adults who a couple of years later, after the body of a boy my age was found hanging, joined the great and the good of the town and its churches in bringing in a youth pastor to harangue us for 2 hours about the deadly risks of autoerotic asphyxiation. The sort of adults who just pretended my friend had either never existed or had simply stupidly slipped by accident while trying to sinfully masturbate, while, by the way, fully dressed. Their contribution was infuriating, but at least relatively neutral. The ones who couldn't hear me talking about my harming my own body without thinking they might earn the credit for saving my soul? The ones who felt it was so damned important to tell a suicidal child they were damned and sinful and needed redemption rather than empathy? Their contribution was to make it worse and isolate me further, to actively and aggressively push me deeper down the gyre that I'd just been slipping down on my own. That cascade failure infuriates me to this day. I'm not angry at them, these particular adults. When I'm feeling generous, that's because I know they were only working with the deck they'd been dealt, and as Norm Macdonald would have said, that dealer was a real jerk. When I'm feeling less generous, it's because there's no more point in being angry at something as dumb as a post than there is at being angry at the post. Either way, does anything get moved? Now, what I'm angry about is how the entire culture I was raised in failed me and failed so many kids around me. How it failed my rapist, leading to my rape, leading to my slide towards suicide. When there's a slide and everyone knows it's there and it's dangerous, when everyone with even an inkling of common sense should know that kids are going to use that slide and they're going to get hurt on that slide, how is it that most adults refuse to talk to the kids about it at all? Or expect someone else to do that job well for them? When the adults looking at the damn thing already know that it happened to them and they got hurt on it bad. How is it that there is still something so appealing about the thought-terminating cliches that somehow the good kids just won't use the slide, while the bad kids who do will just get over it? Or that even if they get maimed, that's just the price of reaching the raft of adulthood, where you get to cling to the delusion that it happened to me and I turned out okay for another generation. When there's a slide in front of them and it's dangerous, why do so many assholes either pretend it isn't there or line up to polish and grease the damn thing rather than dismantle it? I had CPTSD brought on by childhood sexual abuse, made crippling by bad parenting and the fugoid and all the shame that heaped atop the pile. I had hypervigilance, severe emotional affect control issues, and I was already prone to dissociation. The simple fact is I arrived on the scene at risk, and there was very likely no way my reintroduction as a teen to sexuality wasn't going to play out poorly for me, unless it involved an unrealistically lucky choice of partner and the ongoing and intensive support of probably several psychiatric professionals. What happened to me can be seen as a unique, tragic set of circumstances that just happened to align poorly. And everyone can tell themselves that a normal kid would have been saved from sliding down the same path towards destruction. Only I watched a lot of normal kids, or at least the ones without precisely the same traumatic experience I had, sliding alongside me. I watched parents who couldn't talk to their kids about sex eventually, tragically, learn that they also couldn't talk to their kids about suicide. The whole time, with their fingers in their ears and their heads up their asses. I watched a lot of PTSD begin in those first moments of undirected and largely uneducated teenage sexuality. Watched a lot of unprepared and often negatively prepared boys and girls fumble their way into all kinds of experiences or threats of sexual violence. And that meant I watched a considerable number of depressions begin. And that's how I watched too many lives for my age come to an end. Now, a lot of kids fumbled along just fine and made decent choices and figured it out for themselves. They worked out how to figure out for themselves what boundaries and consent were and how to both negotiate them and their violation. They survived long enough to mature, and that's great. But virtually every one of them did that in spite of the adults, not because of them. What horrifies me is thinking about how many of them, who turned out okay, went on to parent children the same way they'd been parented. All of that pain, all of that harm, for so much of the generation I was raised alongside, and I've seen it continue into the generations that followed. Now, don't get me wrong, it's gotten better. A few of the old stigmas, at least in the 3 cultures I've called home as an adult, have been at least briefly taken out into the light a few times, shaken off. And at least when it comes to the ones around sexuality, the majority of people have realized they're pretty defective. The kids I grew up around who were Always, from the moment I met them, gay or lesbian or asexual or trans, they'd suffer a lot less today than they did back then, despite the desire of the minority to make their culture worse again. And the ones who suffered enough to get depressed and then to consider suicide, those thoughts are still rarely discussed in public, to the point where even trying to help people with them gets you automatically censored by a pretty stupid artificial intelligence algorithm here on YouTube. But there's so much more potential help now, and it's certainly more widely known and accessible than it was for me and my peers. Thanks to websites and helplines, there are more places to reach than just people you happen to know face to face, at least, even if they will only just signpost you on. The cultural stigmas still remain, but there's also clearly more people trained to try to set them aside and do something to slow the descent. We can talk about the uncomfortable topics of sexuality a lot more, and depression and suicidal ideation a little more, than the first time I really desperately needed to be able to hear those conversations. But too often we can only get that help and hear those conversations if we can recognize we're already in the gyre and pull ourselves out of it long enough to reach out. There are topics, though, that we still can't talk about, that boys and men certainly can't talk about. I asked before, how likely is it that a depressed child is going to receive meaningful, non-judgmental, and actionable support when they discover they're one of the relatively few that reaches the point of suicidal ideation? These days, yes, things have improved when it comes to thoughts of self-harm, but what about the things that remain unspeakable? What if that depressed child either doesn't receive that support, or the support that does arrive either isn't ready to or simply can't address the things that are worse than suicide? And there are worse, far worse places every human mind can visit. How likely is it that a truly severely depressed child is going to receive meaningful, non-judgmental, and actionable support when they discover they're one of the much fewer still that can reach the point where thoughts of self-harm become thoughts of other harm, where homicidal ideation begins? The following passage contains descriptions of homicidal impulses, ideation, and planning. Hi, I'm Michael, and by the morning of my 16th birthday, I had a plan for murder. That again might sound like an exaggeration, like a plea for attention, but again, it's not. I really did have a plan for murder, multiple murders. And this wasn't just a transient violent thought. This was real, at first intrusive, and then ongoing, committed homicidal ideation. I wasn't merely fantasizing. I didn't just have impulses. I had developed a coldly rational, specific, and well-considered plan. My hypervigilance had been paying attention, and like I said earlier, that's been finding the weapons in any room I've entered for as long as I have memories. It's not just been fearfully highlighting them. It's been aggressively learning how to use them. I knew exactly where her father kept several weapons, and I'd figured out several ways to easily access them. I knew where the ammunition was stored, and I'd seen how to load it. I'd never fired a gun in my life, but I understood the mechanics, and I was certain that I could pull the trigger. I knew my victims, the order, and the locations in the house. Her brother, her father, her mother, her. 4 loud bangs. Spread the fuel, light the fire, then one final click that I'd never hear at all. What precipitated that slide from suicidal to homicidal was a ridiculous series of straws being heaped on my already stressed camel's back. My depression had eventually shut down my libido, which impaired my ability to function sexually to my rapist's requirements. After really just a couple of weeks of expressing her frustration with my less frequent attention, she revealed that she'd cheated with multiple people. She swore the acts had been non-consensual, which, being young and naive, I naively accepted because of the individuals she named. But it still meant that not only had my trust and emotional safety and physical safety been violated by the delay in telling me, I'd been unknowingly exposing myself to real danger. Given the time frame and the individuals involved, there was a very real and significant risk of sexually transmitted infection, up to and including HIV, which at the time would have been a death sentence. I'd been willing to endure the pain of self-harming in order to continue to keep her affection and to ensure that the sex she required from me was at least safe. And suddenly I'd discovered I'd been both causing my body agony and, unknowingly, been playing Russian roulette with it. The infidelities weren't enough to justify murder, of course. But if I'd had anything like a healthy self-image and boundaries, the fact she'd continued to pressure me into sexual acts after the cheating had occurred and before she informed me were certainly enough to justify terminating the relationship. Because I had neither, I continued the relationship on the understanding we not be sexual again until we could be tested. But even after that eventually happened, I was fearful and hesitant and didn't want to continue in the same manner as before. In part, that was because of the relief and some reduction in my depression that just came automatically with the pause in my preparatory self-harming. But mainly it was because I was still extremely angry about what had happened and the risk I'd allowed myself to be exposed to. That anger wasn't at her, it was at me. And it also didn't come close to justifying murder, of course. No, what did that was when, in the middle of one particularly brutal argument, she revealed that the infidelities had actually been consensual, that she'd been compelled by them because of my inattention to her, and then told me that since her actions were somehow my fault, I had to forgive her because Jesus had forgiven her, that she'd prayed and Jesus had literally told her he loved her, which meant that I had to love her because her sins were wiped away after she'd cleansed her body. With what, I don't know, but it certainly sounded more corrosive than holy water. And her body being purified meant that I had to give her what she wanted to demonstrate my forgiveness and love, or she was going to be compelled to cheat again, which would mean praying to Jesus again, who would forgive her again, which would restart the whole baffling cycle. Rather than shake my head and walk away, which would have been the sensible and healthy thing to do, in my bewilderment, I tried to understand where she got some of these ideas. And that's when she revealed that her dad had been forgiven many times for what he'd done to her, and that her brother had been forgiven many times for what he'd done to her, and that her mother had been forgiven many times for what she'd done to her. That somehow all of what they'd done to her meant that she needed to be forgiven for what was ultimately her body's sins, and that proof of forgiveness was somehow sexuality with those who'd been harmed by her unclean body, and that all of this was found in the Bible, at least according to her father. Jesus had forgiven her, again, for everything she'd done this time around, and he'd forgiven her for all the other times, and so why couldn't I forgive her, just like Jesus had? Anger drained out of me, all emotion drained out of me. It occurred to me that the answer was because I'm not your God. But it didn't matter, because what did matter is that it had just dawned on me that I'd obviously suffered a major malfunction, because I'd somehow found myself in an incredibly toxic, mutually destructive relationship with a manufactured idiot. I didn't know the specifics. I really didn't want to know the specifics. But it was suddenly clear that her father, who for what I'd seen could only barely read and comprehend his hunting magazines, had long ago determined to assemble or breed up his own little death cult, had somehow enlisted her mother and brother into participating, and had indirectly, because I'd simply been too young and vulnerable to comprehend, much less understand, any of this, left me and my safety in the hands of someone who had descended so utterly far into delusion that they needed to be put out of their misery. This entire family was, quite simply and chillingly, obviously, too infected, dangerous, and stupid to live. Because my self-image was so utterly devastated by my childhood abuse and my parents' reactions and the fugoid they'd started, any woman that was willing to touch me would have been held on a pedestal. My wounded brain had twisted reality so that she and her family and the poor religious understanding they'd all been talking about the whole time we'd been together were just products of poor circumstances, of being marinated by proximity to the many poor churches in a relatively poor town. I'd made excuses. I'd politely deferred when her father and mother had mentioned specific verses, and I went and checked, and they either weren't there at all or didn't say anything like what they'd quoted from memory. Because she was given credit on that pedestal, they were given credit, so despite a mountain of evidence that they simply had no idea what they were talking about, my mask kept fawning, and so I kept assuming what I'd assumed since childhood. That adults knew what they were doing, and it was me that was the ignorant one who had to learn. Suddenly, reality had snapped into excruciating focus. Something compromised and sick had touched me as a child, and it had infected me, but I'd turned all the seething hatred that spawned inwards, always towards me. I hit objects, I devastated things, and I devastated my hands, and I eventually devastated my own flesh. I had fought the urge to devastate other people. I'd made mistakes, I'd made errors, but I'd never crossed the line to compromising another human being's fundamental safety. This family had. Every one of them had, over and over, and now they'd collectively compromised me. And at any moment they could completely excise any and all guilt and abandon any and all responsibility for their actions by just talking to an imaginary friend that didn't remotely resemble any actual biblical account of Jesus the Nazarene. This wasn't poor circumstances. This was apparently a sexually transmitted infestation of multi-generational incest that had so riddled the brains of everyone it touched that they'd been left unrecoverably stupid and barely capable of thinking above the animal. And precisely because I'd arrived with an immune system already weakened and made susceptible by my own multi-generational history of trauma, their disease had touched me and infected me, and it had touched others that I knew. I'd been walking around in a fever of shame and self-loathing that had led me to stumble upon a den full of rabies, and I'd been bitten by something, frothing at the mouth. Left alive, this infected family and their hypersexually active infected daughter were going to spread that infection down all the generations in front of us, and they were going to do that through me, using me. And I knew how sick they were, because you have to understand, at some level I already knew how sick I was. I already knew that urge to harm. I was the same kind of rabid animal foaming at the mouth, just unlike them. I still had enough brains left to recognize that I wanted to bite everything around me, but stop myself. My shame, my entire lifetime of deep, implicit, embodied shame that had to be punished by either starvation or binging or pet food, shame that had to be beaten, needed to be beaten by my father and then tortured by me to be kept from being exposed, was their shame too. That's so important to what comes next. She'd come crashing, falling off that pedestal, while my rapist wasn't above me anymore. She was standing beside me, an actual peer. And that meant that what I'd felt as the incredible intensity of myopic teenage love transmuted into the incredible intensity of myopic teenage hate. I'd felt anger all my life, but it was always, ever directed inwards. I didn't hit people because people were better than me. I wasn't allowed to cause them pain. The pain was for me, my punishment for merely being, for some reason, born the kind of thing. It was okay to rape at 5 and then starve at 6 and then rape again at 15. And now there was a house full of things just as, if not more, filthy. I've described how much I loathed that house. On that day, I was planning to erase any trace of that house, them, their history, and what it had done to me from existence. I was ready to do anything necessary to sear that house and all the sickness it harbored to the bedrock, and that absolutely included me inside of it. Acknowledging that I once had means, motive, and opportunity for a murder-suicide in public is actually terrifying, even though I'm one of the majority of people who've reached homicidal ideation that never acted on those thoughts. It's terrifying because I know how my CPTSD actually works. I know that it was able to help convince my rational thinking self that my motive was both justified and valid. And nothing's changed with distance. I can't be certain of the facts or if what I understood from her in a heated argument even were the facts, no matter how much they matched with my instincts and my observations of her family. But if they were the actual facts, then my thinking was and is solid. That means I still have the motive. Worse than that, I know that my hypervigilance and everything it's developed in me both before and since has always provided and always will be able to provide the means. I've tried to hint at what hypervigilance, perpetually activated, can lead to, how it looks at the world and learns about it, and every single solitary time it learns something dangerous, it squirrels that knowledge away for future use. Over the decades, its constant operation has armed me in ways I find it very hard to convey without sounding grandiose or boastful in another typical and toxically male fashion. But give me access to a decently stocked machine shop, the right fuels and oxidizer, and a 6-inch disc of 1/4-inch thick copper, and I can build you a perfectly adequate anti-tank landmine in a couple of days. I am just being honest when I report that my hypervigilance has armed me. And it can never be disarmed, which means neither can I. I have the means for murder today, and I will always have those means, because the simple fact is that after a lifetime of violently paying attention to violence, I am the means for murder. For the last 3.5 decades, I haven't allowed myself anywhere near that house. I've intentionally isolated myself hundreds and then thousands of miles away from my oldest friends and my closest family members, precisely because I can't ever be totally certain I can trust myself with means, motive, and opportunity again. Not unless I actually visit that house or get the means to destroy it remotely and discover that I don't automatically lay waste to it and everything and everyone within. Thankfully, no one has ever been stupid enough to vote me into executive office. Yet. I hadn't received any meaningful help with my self-harming, my slide into depression, or with the suicidal thoughts that brought on. When my thoughts turned homicidal, it was already clear help wasn't going to come from outside ever. There wasn't an adult alive I could approach with these thoughts. From everything that had been set out in front of me, even hinting that these ideas and plans were forming would result in an unthinking, automatic response that wouldn't and couldn't help at all. The police showing up was certainly not going to help me. I might have been an idiot kid, but I'd paid enough attention in Mr. Tave's social studies class to understand that in a representative democracy, the police are the literal embodiment of the lowest common denominator of the will of the electorate. Well, the electorate in that country, at that time, believed I could consent to any act with a woman of my own age or higher. Well, there was precisely one act she couldn't consent to with me. Legally, exactly one of us had committed a crime, which she'd introduced me to and enthusiastically asked me to commit. There was no conceivable way I'd be heard out, even if I'd been lucky enough to draw one of the nearly non-existent female officers. I could maybe have disclosed even the barest, most top-level sketch of what had been happening to me too. The prevailing wisdom of the day would have been that I was a disgruntled fat boy, enraged at his girlfriend for having cheated on him. They'd have blamed my atheism, or the fact that I'd listened to rap music, dabbled with Dungeons and Dragons, or had been led astray by playing too much Mortal Kombat or other video games. Not one of these idiot people was going to push past their idiot biases to hear or understand more. It's taken me more than 3 decades to reach the point I can say out loud to a mute camera that can't respond at all some of the things that have been happening to me and my body. Even today, if I'd be able to get past the stuttering and the stammering, even trying to get close to the details, forces onto my lips and throat and voice box, if I could get past the way it tries to choke off the voice of someone who knows what it feels like to be choked to death, it would require an extraordinarily thoughtful person with years of training to respond appropriately to what had occurred to me. Well, with all due respect to the police of Abbotsford in the day, and I'm related to one of them, and so I do feel that respect, they weren't either required, trained, paid, or equipped to be extraordinarily thoughtful enough people to have been any help to anyone like me on that day. For the police to have actually helped me, they'd have to have shown up, listened, understood, and then purged the nest I'd found for me with righteous fire. Anything less was, at best, going to harm me. At worst, it would also have stopped me from purging it myself. Institutionalization also wasn't going to help me. While my thoughts were definitely extreme, they weren't delusions, psychosis, or some sort of schizophrenic break. Drugs might have turned me into a drooling husk, and I might have gotten enough distance on them to get some respite, and the depression might even have lifted, but they weren't going to help with my suicidal or homicidal ideation. I wasn't crazy. There was no chemical imbalance driving these thoughts, no visual or auditory hallucinations, and there certainly was no dog telling me what to do in the name of Satan. I had simply realized, and I was coldly, calculatingly correct, that removing myself and this family from the world would, on a very small but definite scale, make the world a better place. By stopping dead in its tracks all these disasters that had been rolling downhill for generations and had plowed into and through me. What I'm trying to drive home here is that interventions that tried to treat my homicidal ideation as mental illness would have been disastrously off the mark. Neither the suicidal ideas or the homicidal ones were themselves mental illness. I was made prone to them by mental illness. Both CPTSD and then depression saw to that. But they are signs and symptoms, not sickness itself. I had reached first suicidality and now homicidality because of actions taken by people who felt justified because of bad thinking. And that very definitely and explicitly included me and my own thinking. And that had harmed me very severely and made my existing mental illness considerably worse. But treating the mental illness wasn't going to directly address the root causes of the thinking, or stop or impede my planning. Doing that was something I had to figure out for myself in the same fumbling, ignorant, stupid fashion I had had to figure out everything up until this point. I was again responsible for what had happened to me, though I didn't really understand the importance of that word, not yet. This moment, how I was forced to navigate it, and how doing so left me both alive and, importantly still, to this day, not a murderer, represents the start of the journey towards that understanding. To learn about the chain of responsibility, I had to learn that I was a link in it, and that I was either going to hold or I was going to shatter, and that if I was going to hold, I was going to have to learn a secret that was going to shatter everything that remained of the illusion of me. I was going to have to learn something about myself I wouldn't be able to tell anyone else for nearly 34 years. If you've made it this far, that's because I've walked you here. I've slowly, but surely, and very intentionally expanded the story you thought you were being told into the story I have always needed to tell you. Along the way, I've been dropping hints. I've told you the truth, just not all of it at once. I've told you I've been dead inside since I was 5, that a boy named Mike died, and what remained eventually adopted the name Michael. I've told you that I can't feel pride because of that, and that I can't even recognize my own body. Never in the mirror, but there have been times I'm so dissociated that without the ink I had stitched into them, I don't even know these are my arms or my hands in front of my face. I've told you that when I see my eyes in the mirror, there's no one and no thing looking back. I've told you I'm not angry at people I have every right to be angry at, and that I've forgiven people who've done unforgivable things to me. I've told you that I can't even reliably feel my body as I cause it excruciating pain. And all of this revisiting and retelling started with me being asked over and over an excruciating number of times what secret made me capable of ignoring my body's excruciating hunger. Here, this moment I'm describing, when I'm both suicidal and homicidal, and I actually really know that I've got the ability to make the world an actually better place by just tipping over the scale and acting on those impulses, this was my first conscious psychological crisis. Crisis is the point in any disease where it's either survived or it's fatal. And this was the first time I really came face to face with the fact that I have a chronic mental illness and that it will eventually either kill me or I'll survive just long enough to be killed by something else. It's the first time I come into direct contact with exactly who, and more importantly, what I am, have always been, and had only indirectly seen since my first day of school, in fleeting glimpses of reflections, in the man that maimed me that day, whose face, if I ever try to look up during a flashback, I can only ever see as my own. Then in the father that tried to beat the need for discipline his father had beaten into him, into me. In the mother that tried to reach and keep her own mother's love by reaching for and keeping food out of my mouth. It's not the last crisis or the last time we met. There have been many more, and if I can endure being alive much longer, then there will be more still to come. The moment I allowed my body to get kicked in the head by 2 meaningless, pitiful cretins on the Peterborough embankment and didn't cave their just slightly more than paper-thin skulls in, is just the most recent opening of those floodgates. And my reason for telling you this story, for finally telling you my secret now, is that I had to do all of this undirected and without any real help from others again. And I am angry beyond the scope of words that this society hasn't figured out how to actually help someone or something like me through a crisis. Thank you for listening to Descent, the 5th episode of this 8-part series. My story continues in episode 6, Self-Recognition, available now.